Hi, everybody. This is Tony Nash with Complete Intelligence. Thanks for joining us for another quick hit. These are very short interviews where we talk to experts in their field to really understand their views of markets and events and see how kind of you can work it into your risk strategies, your planning strategies, your forecasts, and so on and so forth. Today, we're joined by Chris Narayanan with INTL FCStone in their capital markets. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us just a little bit about what you do?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Tony.
Of course.
So I've held several different roles in the commodity space over the years. I've been a commodities analyst, I've been an equity analyst for commodity companies, and now functioning as an investment banker, helping our client base, middle market companies, to raise capital up and down the supply chain.
Very good. So thanks for that. And again, thanks for taking the time to join us. I wanted to talk a little bit about ag markets, ag commodity markets. And, we've seen with all of the COVID related issues, we've seen demand really fall. We've seen things like potatoes stacking up and milk being, poured out to be destroyed, these sorts of things. That's obviously, it's deflationary, it's wasteful, and so on and so forth. How is that impacting markets in terms of the expected supply coming on? And how long do you expect this demand issue to be there?
Sure. Well, and first I think it's important to take a step back. When you look at the commodity space, especially in agriculture, in a lot of areas, we've been oversupplied for several years.
Mm,
And then when the trade war hit, that just was another, hit to the system. And now the coronavirus is here, another hit to the system. And so we're trying to chew through this as quickly as possible. And yes, there are. And then, when you look at more people now shifting from eating out to eating at home, the buying patterns are changing. The foodstuff needs are changing. So then you go all the way back through the supply chain, back to the farmer and the rancher. It changes the dynamic of that. So now, USDA came out today. Today's May 12th, with their monthly ag supply and demand report, and they're pretty optimistic for southern demand in a lot of the crops for the new crop year. Now that's going to take some time, and obviously these are just projections. Looking at my screen right now, the market is a little, lukewarm to it right now, but the proof will be, as we get through, go through the growing season, see what kind of supply we expect, and then of course once the harvest hits, what where we are in terms of the global economy and how much we actually need.
okay. We saw some freezes over the weekend as well in the Midwest. Is that hurting things, or is that late freeze something that just happens occasionally and markets just work that in?
It depends on where it is and what stage they are. Planting is kind of all over the place in a lot of areas, and it depends on what crop you're talking about as well. I don't think you can make a blanket statement on that, but certainly, if depending on the damage and the intensity on the area, there could be some damage, and that might be supportive to prices at some point. But I think it's a little early to say.
What about things like corn? When we can kind of move into maybe talking about ethanol or fuels or something like that, some of the downstream products. Do you see this freeze kind of hurting the corn crop, so it would tighten up that demand environment a little bit, or is it just kind of it's all fine and it's not really going to hurt the supply?
Again, it depends on where they are in planning. Certainly we're here in the middle of May. A lot of people hope to be done by now. And so if they didn't get it in the ground, they might delay it for a couple of weeks. If they did have it in the ground, they had some early emergence in some of the southern areas, but where the frost really didn't hit, it shouldn't have that big of an impact.
Okay.
I think the big thing really is, how do we use up the corn that we have? We've
Mhm.
seen, in the last decade, we've seen a huge increase in corn supplies, and stocks to use is what I look at when I look at the amount that's left over at the end of a crop year divided by how much we used in that particular year,
Right.
and that's been on a, it's been on a rise, and I think ethanol is a big portion of it, right? And when people talk about ethanol, we need to increase the blend rate, go from E10 to E15 or even higher, in my opinion, this is just my personal opinion, that's just kicking the can down the road, because yeah, you'll see an uptick for a little while, 5, 7 years or whatever that number is, and then it's going to level off again back to where we are, right? And so you just reset the base, but you don't really solve the problem in a more long-term fashion. And I think the two biggest things, and now it'd be, I'll add a third one at the end that we're seeing, with current situation. But first, we were driving, fuel efficiency on vehicles have increased over the last,
Mm-hmm.
15, 20 years, right? So we're driving more miles per gallon of gasoline. So incrementally, you need less ethanol to blend with the gasoline.
Sure.
And then the second part of efficiency is we're producing more gallons of ethanol with less bushels of corn, right?
Mm.
And or with the same amount of bushels, we're producing more, right? Either way you look at it, again, you need less corn than you did before. And now with the coronavirus, people aren't driving. We have a lot of stay-at-home orders, that are starting to expire in parts of the country. But again, you're not driving, so you just don't need to buy as much gasoline. I mean, my truck, is at a half a tank, and I think the last time I filled it was about a month and a half ago or 2 months ago. And so I don't even know if I'll get the cheap gas prices by the time it's ready for me to refill it. So, I think really what we need to look at when we look at ethanol is how can we best work in the global trade, and what are the export markets, and really work on stuff like that. For example, we have the RFS and the RFS2, biofuels, advanced biofuels.
Okay.
Can we bring in Brazilian ethanol made from sugarcane and export corn ethanol to them? That's just one example of a symbiotic relationship where the blenders here would get the credits.
How does
And
that different? Are there differences between sugarcane ethanol and corn ethanol? I mean, in terms of the end use.
right, in terms of the end use, no,
Okay.
it's the same. It's really the process in which it's made and how EPA and other organizations look at the efficiency, the cleanliness,
Right.
just the process of producing it all. At the end of the day, theoretically anyway, obviously the blends and specs will dictate, but theoretically it's going to be just there'll be substitutes of each other,
Okay.
you know.
Okay. Very good. All right. So I'm just curious, just to dig into that, why would the U.S. import Brazilian and export corn? Like, is there are they substitutional? Pardon my ignorance, but I don't really know the ethanol markets very well.
Yeah, I mean, to an
Sure.
extent, they are a substitute, so that makes it a little bit more practical.
Okay.
But there's also back when we had blending credits and everything else,
Mhm.
there were different credits that you can get depending on what stage biofuels. So corn ethanol was the most basic. Then you had things like sugarcane or cellulosic, so from the corn stove or all the waste, if you can produce ethanol from that, and some of the other like what they call second or third generation fuels. And
Okay.
so, from a completely economic standpoint, if you're a blender that has to purchase this ethanol to mix in with your gasoline,
Hmm.
um, there was at the time an incentive involved in that, right, for the added cost of doing this. And so, if we can work through this policy, maybe update the policy, look at our global trade, where you know in any given year you might have a surplus in one country or the other, why not introduce some kind of a trade scheme where you help each other out, right? Where
Sure.
you're
Yeah.
still able to have that. Because if you go to Brazil, for example, you can go to a pump and they literally dial in. They're a fully flex fuel. They can go from E0 to E100. They can run their engines on both,
Interesting.
and they run that mix depending on the economics. I think it was like 70. If the price of ethanol was 70% of gasoline or less, then it was more economic to use ethanol because there were, some people say that you see a slight loss in fuel efficiency, and
Yeah.
so there's that kind of scale that you can apply,
Mhm.
and so using that to your advantage, looking at the fact that hey, you know what, yeah, sure, we can increase the blend wall here, and maybe we go to E10 or sorry E20 or 25, and the tests from the engineers show that that's not going to do anything to the vehicle. That's great, but again, it's a temporary fix, temporary meaning in the next 10 years versus what
Sure.
I'm looking like 30, 40 years ahead in the future, and where American agriculture can go.
Okay, this is great because I hadn't thought about talking about ethanol today, but it's fantastic. So with crude oil prices depressed, how hard will it be to get those refiners to include ethanol or those blenders to include ethanol if crude and gasoline are super cheap?
So here's the thing that nobody talks about. So we
Okay.
have the Clean Air Act, which
Mhm.
introduced the CAFE standards for fuel
Mhm.
efficiency, right? And within that, in 30 different metropolitan areas around the U.S., you have to introduce some kind of an oxygenet. Try to
Mhm.
say that to basically to treat the gasoline. Now
Okay.
MTBE was the preferred substance at the time, but then it was found to pollute groundwater. 30 some odd different states banned it, so that effectively made it a de facto nationwide
Mhm.
ban on it. So, but to meet the Clean Air Act and those CAFE standards, you had to introduce something. Ethanol was what came in. It burned clean. It was renewable. It didn't pollute groundwater,
Mm.
and it helped make that standard. And when I was at a previous job, so going back about 7 years ago or so, um, I was working with one of my other commodity analysts, and we did a joint paper on corn, crude, or corn, gasoline, and
Mhm.
ethanol. And if memory serves, it was like E6.2 or something like that, where when you look at the different summer blends versus the winter blend, the different metropolitan areas, and you kind of distill down, all right, what do we actually need?
Mm.
Until you find another additive to take the place of ethanol that's cheaper,
Mhm.
um, safer, or at least as safe, you still have some incremental demand that needs to be put into the gasoline. That's just required by law. And that comes out to be six and change in terms of percentage
Interesting.
points. So there's actually a floor that people don't realize on ethanol until we find something that's at least as safe, if not safer, and economically cheaper to produce.
Very good. Chris, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I'd love to
Absolutely.
circle back and talk about other ag commodities in a couple
Sure.
months and just see where things are. And I'm really glad that we could learn about corn and ethanol today. And look, if there's anything else, we'll get in touch. So thanks very much for your time. I really
Hey,
appreciate it.
give me a holler anytime.
Great.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.